Hello everyone. So welcome to today's lecture, which is going to be about unsupervised learning. First of all, I would like to say that this is a two-part lecture, even though it has a common Jupyter notebook. So what you'll see is that there is a lecture which will be released today, and then another one in a couple of days, which will be part 2, but the same Jupyter notebook is going to be used throughout. So the objective of today's lecture is to go through quite a few topics. First of all, we're going to look into classical unsupervised learning, which is going to touch upon subjects like PCA, manifold learning, and all the different subtypes of manifold learning. And in the next lectures, this one and next one, we're going to be looking into autoencoders, into variational autoencoders and beta VAEs, which are two modifications to the original autoencoders. We're going to see how do we condition to be able to generate specific types of samples, and also how do we extend those models in order to be able to introduce, for example, adversarial forms of training or using quantized vectors. Why do we actually want to do unsupervised learning? What's the purpose? There's many purposes, and really this is something that has to do with scientific introspection. It's something we want to learn about the data. So unsupervised learning allows you to do many things, such as, for example, understanding variations in the data, in the appearances of the objects that you might see, for example, in images. Because you're projecting the data into a subspace most of the times, you can also use it for data compression. And because this data compression follows some of the characteristics of the data, and we're going to see what that means in a second, you should then be able to compress the data by preserving only the information that exists in that subspace. You can also use unsupervised learning as a way to tackle the curse of dimensionality. So this is situations where you have so many dimensions in terms of your feature vector that your machine learning algorithm might become very hard to train. And the reason for it is because the distance from a point to its other points, to data points within your data set, tends to infinity when the number of dimensions also tends to a large number. And because of this, we need to be in a setting where we need to project the data down to a smaller subspace with less dimensions, so that you need to have less data to be able to fit your machine learning models. You can also use it for visualization purposes by looking into different parts of the learned subspace. You can then understand what the different phenotypes and different variations are, but you can also use it to visualize where different images exist within that subspace. And you also have a way to create what is called here a meaningful distance metric. What that means is, for example, if you imagine that you have two images and you were to calculate a standard metric between them, let's say the L2 norm, those differences that you're going to observe are not going to be necessarily informative of the similarities between images. For example, an image that is slightly translated to the right might have a very similar content, but because it's translated to the right, you might have a very large L2 norm between them. When in reality, if you were to use some sort of perceptive loss, something that is characterizing the content of the image, then those two images should be actually very similar to each other. And unsupervised learning allows you to project it to a subspace where these metrics become a little bit more informative. The simplest of these methods is probably PCA, Principal Components Analysis. This is something that you've probably learned in previous machine learning courses. And in an intuitive kind of way, what PCA does, it projects data from a space of X into the space of Z, and it does so by learning a specific rotation matrix. And it does this in order to be able to learn the directions of variation of the data and how much does the data vary in those directions. These are called the eigenvectors and the eigenvalues, respectively. So this projection itself removes all linear collinearities in the data, which means you end up with data that is of lower dimension if you were to remove some of the eigenvectors and eigenvalues that have eigenvalues that are really low. But you also end up with a representation of the data that does not have any linear correlations. And that means algorithms that, for example, might not work very well in the presence of data or features that are highly correlated. These correlations will be removed because of the orthonormal basis of the PCA methodology. So the way that I like to think about principal component analysis is that you can think about it as fitting a n-dimensional ellipsoid to the data that you're observing. So in the previous slide, you were seeing that the data is spread around like a cloud of points, and this cloud of points has a main axis of variation, which you can see is a diagonal. And so that axis becomes the axis of largest variation. In this case, it's going to be the first principal component. And the orthogonal axis to that one, which is the axis of smallest variation, is going to be the second principal component. If you were to omit the second direction of variation, you'll still preserve most of the information because you preserve the direction that varies the most. So you can omit certain directions of variation, the ones that have small eigenvalues, and by doing so, you also reduce the dimensionality of the problem. So the way you apply this is you have a series of steps. You first subtract the mean of the sample to the center of the data. So you bring the data to the zero location. So you demean the data itself. Then you compute the covariance matrix of the data. You calculate the covariance eigenvalues and eigenvectors. So those will tell you the directions of variation. And because they're eigenvalues and eigenvectors, they give you an orthonormal basis to the data. So you end up with a orthonormalized version of the input data. And in the end, you end up with that orthonormal basis, but also it tells you how much data varies along each one of the directions, because that information is encoded in the eigenvalues. So the PCA model considers that you start from an mn dimensional space, which is a design matrix S. So it assumes that the data has a mean of 0. So the expectation of x is 0. This is achieved by demeaning the data before you do anything else with it. And it also assumes that you're going to estimate this unbiased covariance matrix of S given the equation that you see below, which is basically doing 1 over m minus 1 x transpose x. This is the standard equation for variance and is the unbiased estimator. So what you would like to do is to find this PCA solution, which is to find an x which is equal to x transpose w, where the variance here is a diagonal. So if w is the singular vectors of x, then the following is true. So you end up with this decomposition here. And with this decomposition, you can then show the x transpose x. It becomes the equation that you see below, which then gives you a solution to the PCA model. We're not going to go through the full derivation, but you have it here on the screen. And the only thing that this derivation is showing is that there is a direct relationship between the variance of x and the variance of z, which is up to that specific transformation matrix W that you see there, which is the matrix that orthonormalizes the data and projects it to the lower dimensional space, or the orthonormal space. So the advantages of a model like PCA is that it's fast, it gives you an orthogonal basis, and for signals that have a Gaussian form, obviously PCA is ideal because it's exactly what it assumes. The disadvantages is that it assumes that all correlations are linear. So it does not assume that data has any other structure beyond that kind of linear relationship that the variance can model. An example of modes of variation applied to imaging data. For example, here you see an example of spatial modes of variation, spatial temporal modes of variation of patients with Alzheimer's disease and specific tracers. What you see is if you decompose the different modes of variation of imaging data, and you were to, for example, travel along the direction between healthy controls, the normal controls in green, and Alzheimer's disease in red, you see that the amount of tracer that gets deposited in different parts of the brain is increasing at the top and is binding slightly less at the bottom. And this is exactly what you'd expect in patients with dementia. So they have more binding in certain areas and less binding in other areas depending on the tracer that you're using. But what's interesting here is that this visualization here, even though that's exactly what is expected from a biological point of view, was obtained from data in a purely unsupervised way. So we were able to understand the pattern, even though nothing about the pattern itself was provided to the algorithm beyond just a bunch of images that sit at different points of this progression curve. Another example of using PCA, actually, this is not really PCA, this is PLSR, which is a variant of PCA that allows you to understand relationships between more than one input data set. This is showing that there is a relationship, a strong relationship in patterns observed in anatomical imaging, for example, T1 imaging, MRI T1 imaging, and FDG PET imaging. And this relationship obviously is expected. So for example, when atrophy happens in a specific part of the brain, which you will see in terms of the anatomical imaging, is going to change the tracer deposition in an FDG PET examination. And these relationships, obviously they exist, they're spatially distributed, and they have several components which might explain different disease patterns, or at least different contributions of different areas to different disease patterns. So what's interesting about when we think about unsupervised learning is thinking about linear data transformations and linear relationships, or nonlinear relationships that might exist between the data. What this means is that in a linear setting, we are assuming that datasets live on a linear space, while in a nonlinear setting, we're assuming that there is a nonlinear relationship between them. So if you were to just calculate, for example, the L2 norm between these letters A that you see here on the screen, so let's say the top leftmost image and the one just next to it, for example, on the right, even though the difference between them is quite small, because it's only been rotated by a very small amount, the L2 norm between them can actually be quite large. So metrics like L2 norms, for example, do not really tell you much about how similar they are. But if you were to do this analysis in a nonlinear setting, then you might find out that actually that A, and the slightly rotated version of the same A, are actually very close to each other in this subspace. And because they are close to each other, then we need to model these relationships between the data that are not described by linear correlations. There is this very classical example that everyone uses to explain what dimensionality reduction does, which is called the Swiss rule. And the idea here is that you have some points that are living on some space, let's say a three-dimensional space, like the one you see on the image on the top left. And these points are sitting on a surface that is slightly twisted inwards. So it's like the Swiss roll, is an ellipse that is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. It's a surface that is curling on itself. And if you think about it, if you were to run PCA on such a surface, the biggest mode of variation is probably going to be along that elongated spiral. And the second mode of variation is probably going to be radial to that spiral. And that's because we're thinking about fitting these Gaussians or ellipsoids to the data itself, when in reality the data doesn't look like this, or it doesn't really have that kind of structure. We know that this is a Swiss roll, so the data is spread around like a Swiss roll and is rolling on itself. And because of this, we need to use methodologies that can project it and retrieve that structure. So you see that the points, again on the top left, that are sitting closer to the center of the Swiss roll are in blue. And as we unroll the Swiss roll, we're going to go through green, then yellow, then orange, and then red. Just to make sure, I can now point at it here. For example, you see the blue part here, which is at the center of the Swiss roll. Then it goes through the green part, the yellow, and then the red part, right? So the Swiss roll has this kind of curly structure. So if we were to, for example, run a different type of algorithm, like the local linear embedding or a regularized version of that, you end up with transformations like this, right? So this is telling you that these points are closer to each other and are at a certain location in this two-dimensional space. So this is a two-dimensional projection of the Swiss roll that lives in 3D, while these are the first two dimensions of the LLE dimensionality reduced subspace. So you see that it has unwrapped the Swiss roll, and now the blue points are on one side and the red points are on the other side, like you'd expect. And the slightly regularized version of this ends up with a definition which is much closer to the true unrolled manifold, which is what you see here on the top right. So manifold learning has actually been used in medical imaging quite a bit. For example, a very well-known example here of using dimensionality reduction primarily for visualization purposes is if you look at images of the cardiac cycle. So if the heart is beating, obviously the different frames of a beating heart are close to each other from a perceptual point of view, from the object's point of view, but not necessarily when you look at, for example, an L2 norm between them, like just a different linear metric between them, because the amount of noise and the amount of variation that might exist and the contraction that you might see of the muscle wall is probably going to change quite a large amount the L2 norm or the metric that you might use. So if you were to do nonlinear dimensionality reduction, you'll end up in a situation where the heart is beating in a specific submanifold. So points along different frames of the cardiac cycle are closer to each other, and then the heart starts expanding and then it starts contracting again. So every time you go through a full cardiac cycle, you go through these loops where the points go from one specific position to another position. And if you were now to, for example, interpolate between points, because you might want to, for example, increase the frequency of the imaging that you might be doing, then rather than averaging points in a linear way, you're averaging points, or you're finding intermediary locations along these manifold, along of this path that you're seeing here in this two-dimensional submanifold. One way to achieve this nonlinear dimensionality reduction using a method that you've seen before, which is PCA, is to do something called the kernel transformation. So what we know from machine learning is that if we have n points, they can't normally be linearly separated in d dimensions if d is smaller than n. But they can almost always be linearly separated in d dimensions if d is bigger than n. Thus, if we map n d-dimensional points to an n-dimensional space, we can construct an hyperplane that is linearly separable. So for example, if you have 2 points and you want to separate them, 2 points living in a two-dimensional space, you can always separate those 2 points. If you have 3 points in a three-dimensional space, you can always separate, again, for example, 2 points from the other one. You can always do these kinds of things in a d-dimensional space. So the way you can project them to a higher dimensional space, which is a space of n, is you can do it using a function. For example, in this case, it's just that function that you see below defined by k. And k is, for example, the inner product space, or also called the Gramian matrix of the function itself. So you basically end up with n elements per column of k, which represents the relationships, or in this case called the dot product, of one point with respect to all of the other points. One way to visualize this, and I always like this example very much, let's say, for example, you have these points here, the green points, the blue points, and the red points on the image on the top right. So one thing that you can immediately see here is that it will be very hard for example, if you were to classify, again, we're looking to unsupervised learning, not classification, but if you were to classify these points, it will be very hard for example, you to be able to say, okay, I want to create a separation here between these green and the blue points. And the reason that it would be hard is because the plane you can fit is going to be a plane, right? So if you take a plane and you cross these points, there is no plane that separates green, blue, and red. However, if you, for example, were to apply the matrix inner product based kernel, which is the one that you see here on the top left, what you'll end up is points that look like the ones below. And you see here, you now have a much more interesting separation. So points that were in the center of this space, in close to the position 0, 0, now went to this position 0, 0 in the second domain. So they're all compacted almost into a single point here on the right. But the points that were slightly further apart, or further away from the 0, 0, now have this negative first component, and they're spread outwards. In this new subspace, you can now create a simple plane that will bisect the green and the blue points, and also the blue points and the red points. And this plane, obviously, if you were to project it back, it would not be a plane anymore if you were to project it back to this space. What's interesting about this is that this lower dimensional space also tells you quite a bit about the variations of the data. So it's much more interesting to look at the first component of this plot, so things that are along the x direction. This is a much more interesting axis variation. And the ones that are along the second component, so the y-axis in this plane, are something that was in the radial direction in the previous plot. If you were to apply another kernel, for example, let's say the Gaussian kernel, which is calculating basically the Gaussian function between the different point locations, you end up with a distribution that then looks like this. You see again the green points on one side, the blue points on another side, and the red points on another side. The point from this slide is to show that different types of transformations that can be estimated by calculating specific kernel products between the different elements of the data points, like the one that you've seen before and the one that you're seeing here, allow us very often to transform the data into another space. And in this new space, the manifold, or the distribution of the data, which might not have been very obvious from the beginning, might now become much more obvious. Something like kernel PCA has actually been again applied to medical imaging data. For example, here you have kernel PCA being applied to heart beating, and if you were to look into the time component of the heart beating, you will end up with these really beautiful pictures here where you see, for example, at the specific location of this image, this is what a time stamp looks like. So when you're traveling in time, this is what that specific line looks like, and you really see the heart muscle contracting and extending, and that allows you to calculate things, for example, like ejection fraction, because you can calculate ratios between the smallest distance and the largest distance, which tells you how much the heart is actually compressing or not. There's many other machine learning algorithms that allow you to do unsupervised learning. One of the most famous one is something called t-distributed stochastic neighborhood embedding, which solves for this equation here that you see in the center of the slide. And it's just trying to make sure that distances that exist in the original input space and the distances that exist in the embedding space are preserved, so that the structure is preserved. And something like t-distributed stochastic neighborhood embedding, also called TSNE for the people that use it quite frequently, is a kind of algorithm that is the go-to methodology. An intuitive explanation of TSNE is to assume that points are connected by springs. What this means is if you have a specific data point in data space, input data space, which sits on a specific dimensional space, let's say a three-dimensional space, for example, so point in a three-dimensional space. If you now have several of these points, imagine that these points are connected by springs, actual springs that are connecting the point, like physical springs. You now want to project this data into a smaller dimensional space, let's say a two-dimensional space. So you want to represent the same points, again connected by springs, in the lower dimensional space. Let's call this space Y, and this space is going to be 2 dimensions rather than 3 dimensions. We would like now the system to evolve. And what does that mean? So if pairs in Y are far apart, so if 2 points are far apart in the space of Y, in the lower dimensional space, but they are close in the space of X, then you want to bring the 2 Ys closer to each other, because you want the distances in the space of Ys to be as similar as possible to distances in the space of X, so that the springs have relatively the same energy, and vice versa, obviously. And when you evolve according to these laws of physics, these laws of spring minimization, and the specific implementation has some stochasticity and a few other tricks to make sure that the algorithm doesn't get stuck, you end up reaching an equilibrium, and this equilibrium gives you a data representation which is in the two-dimensional space, in the space of Y, but where the distances are preserved as much as they can be compared to the ones that exist in the space of X. So when you run TSNE, there's a few things you need to set up. One of them is the perplexity value, which you can think about it as the stiffness of some of these springs. Also, you need to think about how many steps do you want to do. So that's how many evolution steps do you want to perform. In theory, they should converge to an equilibrium, but not necessarily so, because the system can be unstable. The other thing that TSNE has, and you need to be quite careful about this, is that TSNE might start from something that looks pretty random and might actually be random, and might create clusters purely due to trying to minimize the equation that it's trying to minimize. So for example, if you were to choose a low perplexity after 5,000 steps, you might end up with those kind of clumpy clouds, which look like there is a structure. It looks like things clump together, but it's purely an outcome of the locations of the data points in the original sample. While if the perplexity is very high, you might end up in a situation where the points actually look like they are random, as they were supposed to be, because they were generated from a random data point. So this kind of methodology can be used, for example, to cluster images, purely by fitting the different intensities of the different pixels as a long vector. So in this specific example here, these images are roughly 8 by 8, and you're going to stretch these 8 by 8 data points into an 8 by 8 vector, long vector, and you're going to feed them into TSNE as if each one of these pixel intensities is a specific coordinate in this high-dimensional space. You run TSNE and you want to project it to a two-dimensional space, and you end up with something that looks like the one on the right here, where things that look like ones that are in a specific part of that subspace, things that look like twos are in a completely different part. So it clumps different pixels with specific intensities in certain locations of that space. The last of the methods that I'm presenting here when it comes to classical approaches is called local linear embedding. And in local linear embedding, there's a series of steps that you do, which is to compute the neighbors of each data point. So if you are in a specific space, you calculate which points are closest to that point. And then what you want to do is to calculate weights that if you take the coordinates of the neighbors, and if you were to weight the coordinates of your neighbors, you will be able to reconstruct the point in question. So let's say you are looking at point 1, at the first item of a series of points, and you find the neighbors of 1, and you want to know if you were to weight the coordinates of the neighbors of 1, can you reconstruct 1? So this weight matrix is something that you can then use again in a lower dimensional space. So in the lower dimensional space, you want to be able to reconstruct the points in the lower dimensional space by weighting the coordinates of the neighbors in the lower dimensional space. So relationships between neighbors are preserved using local linear embedding. So in an LLE setting, for example, if you start again with the an S-shaped manifold here rather than the Swiss roll, you clearly see that the surface is the one that you see here on the top left in figure A. And if you were to sample random points in that specific manifold, you would end up with a space B, which is a three-dimensional space. So if you were to calculate the neighborhoods between all of these points, for example, let's say you were to try to reconstruct the position of that point there, you're going to identify that its neighbors, which are all of these points here, if you were to take the coordinates of all of these points and you were to say, oh, I'm going to take 10% of the coordinates here, another 10% of that point, maybe 30% of that one. And if you were to weight these coordinates, you will be able to get this specific location back, the location of the point that you had in question. So these weights that you learn to be able to reconstruct each one of the points in this space, you're going to use them again to be able to find the relationships in this lower dimensional space. So you want to find a new lower dimensional space, Y, that the neighborhoods according to these weight matrices here are preserved compared to the one that was initially in 3 dimensions. This is something that has been used again in medical imaging data, for example here applied to embedding neonatal brains. And what you see here is that the two modes of variation, the one axis and the second axis here, so first and second, shows you basically two different things. So on the very bottom left, you end up with babies that have quite enlarged ventricles, while on the top you end up with babies that have very healthy and chunky brains with very small ventricles, while the other mode of variation is mostly related with contrast and myelination that is happening in this baby's brain. So we've seen a series of classical methodologies for unsupervised learning, and now we're going to move into autoencoders. So autoencoders, again, are based on neural networks, which is the primary topic of this specific module, and is a way to try to achieve the same or similar behavior as the one you've seen before, but is going to be using the methodologies and the approaches and the way of thinking of neural networks, which means it then allows you to introduce a series of other improvements that might have existed in other areas of deep learning in the world of unsupervised learning. So autoencoders are a type of neural networks that, given a specific input, let's call it X, aim to reconstruct the same input itself by projecting it into a latent space Z. What that means is you want to take an input X, you want to pass it through a series of neural network operations, the standard either convolutions or activation functions and things like this, pass through a specific space or a specific set of features Z, and then go back into the space of X and try to approximate it again and reconstruct that X hat that we're seeing here. If the size of X is bigger than the size of Z, then we are looking into under-complete autoencoders. This is the situation you mostly have, and that's the situation is more common, where the input data type or the input data dimensions is larger than the compressed latent space Z, because that means we are compressing information and learning something which is maybe a little bit more meaningful. In a complete autoencoder, the size of the input dimension vector X and the size of the latent space Z is the same. And in an overcomplete setting, you might have a situation where your latent space is actually bigger than your original input space X. And there are reasons you might want to do this. It's less common, but you might want to do this. So for the purpose of this lecture, we're going to discuss under-complete autoencoders going forward. So situations where the latent space is smaller than the space of the input data. So in an autoencoder setting, as I was explaining before, we take an input data vector, X, and we want to pass it through a series of layers, and we're going to see what these layers look like, which we're going to call an encoder. This is just, again, a series of standard operations that are going to take the data and do something with it. So a series of matrix multiplications, nonlinear activations, maybe even convolutions, which we'll see in a few slides. Pass the data through a bottleneck, Z, which is smaller than X because we're looking into these under-complete autoencoders. And then take that representation in the space of Z, this latent space, pass it through a series of new functions, deep learning standard neural network functions, and try to reconstruct the same data. So what you like is the reconstructed input to look the same as the input itself. So the way you should think about autoencoders is that there is two functions that you're trying to learn. You want to learn an encoding function and you want to learn a decoding function. So you want to project points that were inputted in X here. You want to project them into the space of Z. And then you want to take the points in the space of Z and you want to project them again to the space of the output, which is X prime. So it should be the same size as X. And you want X and X prime to look as similar as possible to each other. So if you now look here, if you want X to be as similar as possible to X prime, you just say I want to minimize, for example, the L2 norm between them. And if you assume that this is a one-layer neural network, which is just a vector matrix multiplication plus a nonlinear activation function, then the full autoencoder equation is going to look like the one you see here below. So you take a specific point here, which you're going to then pass through these Wx plus b, which is then going to go through this nonlinear activation function, which is then going to be applied with this W prime, which is then going to give you pass through another nonlinear activation function, and this transform version of the data, X, which was given here as an input, is going to try to be minimized against X. So you want this transform version of the input X to be as similar as possible to X itself. And in order to do so, the parameters here of W, here and here, and also the parameters of B, here and here, will need to learn something about the structure of the data, so that after you do these two projections, you go back and make it look again like X. So if I unroll this out, just to make it a little bit easier to grasp, you have an initial input X, you multiply by this matrix W with parameters that are being learned, and also a specific bias term B, again with parameters that are being learned. You pass these through a activation function, let's say for example a ReLU, that gives you Z. This is the latent space. You then take Z and you multiply by W prime and add B prime, again with parameters that are learned both for W and for B. You pass it through an activation function and again you end up with X prime. So this X prime here is called the reconstruction, and X obviously is the original input. So what you want is for the reconstruction to be as small as possible when compared to X, So you want them to be as similar as possible. And in order to do so, you need to change the parameters of W and W prime and B prime so that this transformation here preserves the structure of the data and the appearance of the data. What's interesting is, depending on the choice of activation function, for example, if you're using a linear activation function rather than a ReLU, and apply that autoencoder that you've seen before, is actually doing something very similar to PCA. So if you were to do PCA on digits, you're going to see basically this decomposition here below, and these are going to be the, let's call the modes variation of the data sets according to the different modes of variation that you'll see. If you were to then do the same thing with a linear autoencoder, you're going to end up with these results here, which do not look perfectly the same, but they look okay. And actually, interestingly, if you were to do singular value decomposition on these specific data points here, on these modes of variation, you'll end up with this representation here, which is actually exactly the same as the one that you see here, up to a sign, which might flip some of the axes around. For example, you see here that the 0 is bright while here is dark. But apart from that, it gives you exactly the same solution. And if you look at the covariance matrix of the data, both in the PCA space and in the space of the autoencoders, they are basically the same. So obviously, if you were to, for example, have way too many dimensions in your latent space Z, the autoencoder will pretty much just learn the identity transformation. So it will transform X into Z and Z into X again by always learning an identity transformation, which is pretty useless. For example, if Z is of the same dimension as X. One of the things that you can do is you can regularize, because that's something you can clearly do when you're having methodologies that are optimized via gradient descent. Any regularizer you could think about that has a continuous formulation could be used. For example, you can introduce sparsity, which is just a regularizing term in terms of the loss function. Rather than minimizing only the L2 norm, you add an extra term which gives you the sparsity penalty. You can use what is called a denoising autoencoder, which is a really interesting concept. So if you take an input X, and if you were to add a specific amount of noise, let's say Gaussian noise here, so you're going to perturb the input X, and this is going to create a new input X tilde. You now want your network to be able to recover X from X tilde. So you want to be able for your autoencoder to remove the noise and recover what the original input was. The interesting thing about this is that the autoencoder now needs to learn which parts of the signal, which is composed by X and N, which parts of the signal are X and which parts are N, because it needs to be able to decompose those two in order to be able to reconstruct X back from an X tilde. So it's kind of the idea that if you were to introduce noise in a signal and you're teaching your network to remove the noise, then the network needs to understand what the signal actually looks like, because it needs to be able to do that to remove the noise. One way to visualize this is, for example, if you have a series of points here, which are, for example, at the end of all of these green arrows here. If the signal is the black line and all of the points were the points in red, for example, if you were to add noise into that signal, the noise would be spread all around here. So the network will need to be able to recover the black line from the noisy versions of the points, which will be at the end of these arrows, right? So it needs to be able to learn to project the data back from these noisy realizations at the end of each one of these arrows back into the black line, which is the actual data line. And it does so by trying to understand which component of the observed signal is due to noise and which component of the observed signal is due to the signal itself. So if you want to visualize it here, for example, take an original input, you partially destroy the input by adding noise, you give that to the network as your input, and you ask the network to reconstruct back the original image prior to you adding the noise, which means now the encoder and the decoder needs to understand that this is a 4 and needs to understand what noise to remove to be able to reconstruct the 4 back. And in order to do that, it needs to understand what 4s look like, if that makes sense. Here are a couple of examples of using denoising autoencoders on images. The image on the left is probably one of the most famous images in the domain of autoencoders. It just takes a series of MNIST digits, adds some noise, and shows what the reconstructions look like. And you see that it's able to recover quite severe degradations, many of them which even myself I'm not really able to discern very well. For example, this number here doesn't really look like a 4 to me, but the network is able to recover that was a 4 pretty well. Obviously, doing this is a way for you to learn the structure of the data, but you can also use the same idea, for example, for denoising images themselves. So if you take an image, you add noise to that image, and you try to reconstruct the image back, the next time you give a noisy image to a model, it will try to recover some of those details. For example, here you see that you have some pretty clean teeth X-ray. Here you're going to add some noise, and this is the image that you recover. So you're recovering this image here from this very noisy realization. This is not the best example. There are some better examples out there, but this was the best image that I could find in a relatively short time. So what is interesting about autoencoders is that there's two forces at play when you're training an autoencoder. First of all, you're trying to learn a latent representation Z of training example X, such that the decoder tries to recover X from Z, right? So you're trying to basically say, I'm going to give you an X, you need to project it to Z, and then you need to project it from Z back to X, and make this reconstructed version of X as similar as possible to the original input. But you want to do this according to specific regularization or penalty constraints, and these penalty constraints can be either explicit through the form of, for example, a sparsity term, or they could be implicit, either, for example, via the denoising autoencoder approach, or purely by making the subspace of Z smaller. And we've seen this before, right? We've seen that manifold learning techniques focus on learning these nonlinear manifolds via these non-parametric methods that rely on creating neighborhood graphs, so understanding which images are neighbors of each images, and then using this understanding of neighborhood to be able to define certain metrics or certain rules that allow you to project to a lower dimensional space. This is what many of the other classical manifold learning techniques do. But the point is, if you're trying to do this, you really need a lot of examples. And the problem is, many of these methods require quite a lot of data to be able to create smooth manifolds. So the idea of using deep learning or autoencoders is to use the classes of functions that we have used throughout the rest of the deep learning domain, but applying it to the autoencoder or the unsupervised learning setting. An example of this is the use of convolutions, right? So convolutions, the reason that people use convolutions is because they are a very succinct or a very simple way of representing patterns in imaging data, because the amount of parameters that they have is very small. The convolutional kernels themselves have relatively small amount of parameters, but they can model very complex interactions in the data. So if you were to replace the linear functions that we've seen before, which are just those vector matrix multiplications and bias terms, and if you were to replace those with convolutions, which only have much fewer parameters than many of those fully connected layers, you will then end up in a situation where you can compress imaging data using exactly the same methodology, but rather than applying a series of linear operators and activation functions, you're applying a series of convolutions and activation functions and backpropagating through them. So for the first part of the practical session, which we will go through together, we're going to be looking into dense convolutional autoencoders. So again, just to recap, these are autoencoders that are going to have convolutional layers as a form of representing and projecting data to the latent space. And then the latent space is going to have a dense series of connections, both from the encoder to the latent space and back into the decoder. So that's the component that we're going to be modeling today. So dense autoencoders project the output of the encoder to the latent space and back to the decoder using a fully dense connection, which can be very parameter heavy. So it takes the output of the encoder, it linearizes it applies a dense connection to the encodings, to the latent space, and then back into the decoding space. You can do something which is a little bit more preserving of the structure and actually preserve some of the spatial components itself by using what is called a spatial autoencoder. A spatial autoencoder, differently from the dense autoencoder, it does not linearize the output of the encoder and then applies a fully dense connection. It does so by preserving the spatial structure itself and using things like 1D convolutions, for example, to be able to project the data into the latent space Z. So we're going to see how this is implemented. So really, in part 2, we're just going to change the implementation we did during part 1 and be able to introduce these spatial convolutional autoencoders. In order for us to be able to go into variational autoencoders, we need to look a little bit into some nomenclature, which probably many of you already know, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page. First of all, I think I need to say this pretty clearly, that a probability density function of a probability p of x needs to meet the following constraints. First of all, the value of p of x needs to be defined for all possible states of x. The value of p of x needs to be bigger or equal to 0, and the integral needs to be equal to 1. Those three things is what it defines a probability density function. Now, to define a couple more terms that are going to be used in the next few slides, observed variables are going to be denoted by x, latent variables are going to be denoted by theta, the joint probability density function is going to be p of x theta, the marginal is going to be the same thing but integrated over theta, the prior PDF again is the same thing but integrated over x, the posterior PDF is p of theta given x, and the likelihood PDF is p of x given theta. So when we're doing Bayesian modeling of data, what we want is to estimate this probability of theta given x. And the way that we achieve this is by using basically one of two methods. Either you use variational inference, which relies on optimization, or you can use sampling methods such as Markov chain Monte Carlo methodologies, which tend to be very computationally expensive. So in this specific course, we're going to look into using the variational inference approach to be able to calculate these variational autoencoders. So in a variational inference setting, we assume that Q of theta given phi exists, that the distribution exists, and it approximates P of theta given x. So if this distribution exists, what we would like to do to make sure that the distributions do match and approximate well is to minimize the Kohlberg-Leibler divergence, also known as the KL divergence, with regards to these parameters of phi. So we want to minimize the parameters of phi in this equation here, so that the KL divergence between this hypothetical distribution here and the true distribution is as small as possible. So the only difference that exists between a variational autoencoder and a standard autoencoder is that in a variational autoencoder, the latent representation is a distribution, and is a distribution that is parameterized by two vectors. A vector of means here, which is represented by this vector mu, and a vector of variances, which is here represented by this vector here of sigma. What you can then do is, if you want to take this latent representation, this probabilistic latent representation, and recreate reconstructed output, what you need to do is to sample from the distribution, and this gives you the sample latent vector, and the sample latent vector is then given to the probabilistic decoder, which reconstructs the input. The way you sample from this is by applying this little kernel trick that you see here. So the sample latent vector is nothing more than the mean of the distribution plus the variance of the distribution multiplied by a sample, which is nothing more than this epsilon sample here, which is drawn from a Gaussian distribution. So we're basically saying we want to have a Gaussian sample from a distribution that has this mean and this variance, and that's going to give me my sample latent vector. The other thing that is different between autoencoders and variational autoencoders is the loss function itself. So the evidence lower bound, as is called, is composed of two terms. The first term, which is this one here, is called the reconstruction term, where we're trying to maximize the log likelihood of the observation given the current estimate of the model parameters. And there's a second term, which is a regularization term, which is this one here that tries to make sure that the distribution of these parameters in this latent space are close to a specific prior distribution, which in the case of variational autoencoders is a Gaussian prior. So we want the representation in the latent space to be close to a Gaussian, and at the same time we want the network to be able to reconstruct the observations x given the current estimate of the parameters. So if we rewrite the equation that you have above so that it fits our settings, a few things have changed and you see them here. The first term here is this q of z given x, which is the approximate posterior density of this latent code z, which is parameterized by these parameters here phi, and this replaces this q of theta that you've seen before. The second term is the p of x given z, which is the likelihood of the model, which is in this case parameterized by theta, and this replaces p of x given theta. And the last part is this p of z, which is the prior code of z, which in this case is parameterized by this lambda and replaces this p of theta that you've seen before. In part 3 of the practical session, we're going to look into how do we change a dense and a spatial autoencoder, which we developed before, into its variational variant. This means adding the mean and variance estimates as that code space, the sampling system, the loss function, and show how can we backpropagate through everything and make sure that we can optimize the model. The good thing about variational autoencoders is that because you know the shape of these distribution of the latent space, you can sample from them, which means you can also generate new images from the model. By the end of this lecture, you will know what autoencoders are and what are information bottlenecks. This is the idea that we have this latent representation Z, which is smaller in dimensions than the input dimensions of the input vector X. And by making it small, we're forcing information to be compressed into a smaller number of feature values. And that compression process, plus a series of regularizers, is going to force the representation to be more informative and give us insights towards patterns that we might not know beforehand. You'll also hopefully understand the differences between a dense and a spatial autoencoder. So ones that have a fully connected layer linking the encoder, the latent space, and the decoder, or the ones that preserve the spatial components of the encoder-decoder output themselves. And you'll also understand the differences between autoencoders and variational autoencoders, both from a practical and from a theoretical point of view. So just as additional resources, we're going to look into some of these in the next lecture, but you have a series of papers that exist which you might want to look into in terms of autoencoders applied to medical imaging data and non-medical imaging data, which I think are quite interesting and appealing to read. I really hope you enjoyed today's lecture. And again, don't forget that you can ask questions either during the practical session or via Geets. Also, don't forget that this is only part 1 of a 2-part series on unsupervised learning. Next lecture, we're going to look into conditioning and further regularizing variational autoencoder methods through the beta VAE setting. And we're also going to be looking into vector quantization as a way to create more compact representations of the data and ways to introduce adversarial learning into the reconstruction methodology to be able to create more accurate samples. So hopefully I'll see you next time.